What does it mean to be a Western yogi? How can someone who was born and raised in the West, who comes from a Judeo-Christian background, practice yoga and meditation in an authentic and genuine way? My name is Christopher Sartain, and this is the Western Yoga Podcast. Greetings, fellow seekers. Welcome to another episode of the Western Yoga Podcast. It's a beautiful sunny day here in southern Chile at our small ashram in the southern Andes Mountains. We have a couple of volunteers arriving tomorrow, so we'll be preparing things for their arrival and for their stay here. You know, volunteering here is a great way to perform seva, or selfless service, or karma yoga, and it's a wonderful way to enjoy the natural beauty surrounding us here at our center. And a lot of folks that come here from the city, and they don't have much experience with country living, country lifestyle, and chopping firewood, making fires, and working in the dirt, getting their hands dirty in the greenhouse and the garden, doing landscaping projects and things like that. And so they really enjoy coming here and learning how to do a lot of things that they don't have access to in the city. We also welcome people from other countries, people from Europe, people from the States that want to come and stay with us when they're traveling through South America. So anyone listening to this podcast is more than welcome to come check out our humble little ashram here and volunteer with us. Stay with us and practice yoga and meditation each day. Enjoy the beauty. We're surrounded by hot springs, probably about 20 hot springs within an hour's drive of where we are. It's a really wonderful place. I'll continue my discussion of the Gospel of Thomas in this episode, and I'll pick out a few verses to discuss and give commentaries on as we proceed. You know, it's really important for Westerners to understand that there is a rich tradition of Western mysticism and contemplative practices, and that mysticism and contemplation and meditation aren't exclusive to India or to the East, and that actually there's a long history of mysticism in the West, especially when we look at Pythagorean mysticism, and Plato, and Neoplatonism, and the Essenes of ancient Judea, and the Abbas or Desert Fathers, the early Christian mystics, and then the later Christian mystics in Europe that practiced essentially meditation and contemplation, and wrote some really powerful texts dealing with mysticism and mystical experience and meditation and all of that. So there is a long, rich tradition of mysticism in the West. And so I think it's important as Western yogis that we acknowledge that tradition. Many of us, myself included, who were raised in rather conservative Protestant Christian churches, fundamentalist churches, unfortunately, we tend to have a sort of aversion to all things Christian or all things Judeo-Christian. It's a shame because we aren't taught growing up that there is a Christian mysticism that we can tap into. And there are many beautiful texts from Saint Teresa of Avila, for example, John of the Cross, Meister Eckhart, Saint Francis of Assisi, and others left us with some really beautiful teachings. And really the first Christian mystic text to ever be written, if we want to use that term, was the Gospel of Thomas, which was written possibly during Jesus' life, but certainly within a few years of Jesus' death on the cross. So that's why I think it's important for us to study the Gospel of Thomas, because if you've listened to the 2 prior podcasts in this series dealing with the Gospel of Thomas, you'll know that it is based on the early teachings of Jesus written down in the so-called Q material, Q source. This Q, by the way, comes from a German word Quelle, something like that, that means source. Yeah, so the Q material, Q source, basically is the earliest written Christian material. Unfortunately, we don't have any copies of it, physical copies of it that we can look at, but we can infer that it existed based upon the canonical Gospels, particularly Matthew and Luke, but also Mark probably used it. And possibly John even used it. And then some other so-called apocryphal Gospels, because they're not part of the official canon, Orthodox canon, also probably utilized this Q material or Q source, which was essentially just Jesus' sayings, especially the earliest Q material. The Q material sort of existed in 2 different parts or 2 different periods or 2 different epochs. But the first, most original Q material was simply sayings of Jesus. So the earliest written material we have, the earliest written Christian material, was simply a collection of Jesus' sayings and teachings. And then those sayings and teachings became essentially the Gospel of Thomas. And the original Greek papyri, there's 3 papyrus texts that were found in Egypt in the late 1800s in Greek. That's the original, or the oldest, rather, copy of the Gospel of Thomas that we have found so far, dating from about 130 AD. And then the Coptic version was found in Nag Hammadi alongside many other Gnostic, so-called Gnostic texts, although the Gospel of Thomas is not a Gnostic gospel or Gnostic text. It was written long before Gnosticism was a movement, long before the Valentinians or the Seth tradition or Mani or any of these other famous Gnostics. So these are the original sayings of Jesus. It's the best, the purest form that we have of Jesus' original teachings available to us. The canonical Gospels, Mark, Matthew, Luke, and then John, have a lot of, there was a lot of editing involved, and many changes were made to those Gospels over the years, and a lot of things were lost in translation, and so on and so forth. And a lot of Jesus' teachings that we find in the earliest Q material were corrupted and changed to fit into a sort of biographical narrative, a sort of Greco-Roman biographical narrative format that the other 4 Gospels use. At any rate, the best, purest teachings of Jesus are found in the Gospel of Thomas. And we should really understand the context out of which Jesus and his teachings came from. And that is the Essene tradition that existed around the Dead Sea, around Galilee, where Jesus is from, where John the Baptist is from, where John the Baptist taught. And if we look at, the writings of the historians like Pliny the Elder, Philo, Josephus, and all these historians, they tell us about the Essenes. Josephus actually looks like he probably lived with a group of Essenes for a while, and so he can really speak with authority over these groups. And he tells us they were vegetarian. They didn't eat meat. They didn't make animal sacrifices like the other Jewish sects did, like the Pharisees and Sadducees, or other Jewish sects that were extant at that time in ancient Judea. They were vegetarians. And they lived in small communities out in the desert, in the middle of nowhere. They practiced ritual bathing every day and purification. That's sort of where the tradition of baptism comes from, John the Baptist and all that. And they were celibate for the most part. There were other small groups of Essenes that were householders, essentially, and had children. But for the most part, they were celibate, mostly men. And they were vegetarians, and they practiced a lot of meditation, contemplation, study of sacred scripture, and so on. And they really revered the prophets and teachers. Matter of fact, in some of the Nag Hammadi texts, you'll find writings about the so-called teacher of righteousness, who has many parallels to Jesus, actually, but existed 150 years prior to Jesus. But at any rate, so they revered teachers, they revered prophets, and so this was a sort of group of yogis in the ancient deserts around the Dead Sea and the Jordan River in ancient Galilee. And so John the Baptist was a vegetarian. Most scholars agree on all of this, by the way. I'm not making anything up. There's general consensus that John the Baptist was a vegetarian and was most likely an Essene. It's possible that he left the Essenes to start his own ministry, his own tradition, which later became the so-called Mandeans. It's complicated, but essentially there's a tradition that eventually ended up in modern-day Iraq, around the Fertile Crescent, that claimed that John the Baptist is their founder, and the Mandeans. At any rate, so John the Baptist was a vegetarian. He practiced ritual bathing. He practiced initiation, ceremonies of initiation, spiritual initiation. And he was celibate, and he practiced deep contemplation, periods of solitude, and all of this. And Jesus said that John the Baptist was his master, was his teacher, was his spiritual teacher and guide. And again, none of this is debated. It's interesting because James, Jesus' brother, who essentially was the first church leader after Jesus' death, so-called James the Just or James the Righteous, was Jesus' brother. And he was really one of the first church leaders. And so he also was a vegetarian. Again, there's a lot of scholarly consensus that he was in fact a vegetarian. Many of the disciples of Jesus were vegetarians. Thomas, probably also a vegetarian. John the Baptist was a vegetarian. So one must ask the question, well, if Jesus' teacher was a vegetarian and Jesus' disciples were vegetarians, it stands to reason that Jesus was probably a vegetarian. And that he came out of this Essene tradition. Jesus probably left behind this Essene tradition to start his own ministry and do his own thing. He was extremely, extremely enlightened, possibly one of the most enlightened beings that the planet has ever seen. And so he was sort of outside of any kind of organized religion or organized tradition with a lot of rules and regulations and all of that. He was beyond all of that. Okay, but that's the context out of which Jesus and his teachings arose, was this Essene tradition, essentially groups of yogis. Of course, they didn't use that term, but they were basically yogis. Okay, celibate, renunciate monks living in the ancient deserts, practicing meditation, ritual bathing, study of sacred scriptures, vegetarian diet, and so on. And so it's important for us to understand as Westerners that these traditions exist and that they went on to influence a lot of Western mysticism and the so-called Gnostic traditions that came after. Okay? Who also practiced a lot of vegetarianism and meditation and contemplation and other spiritual practices that later went on to influence the original Christian monks, the so-called Abbas, or desert fathers, who lived in Egypt for the most part. Basically lived in caves by themselves, had a solitary sort of existence in caves, and essentially studied texts and meditated all day, ate very little, and lived as yogis in caves, basically. And this went on to influence a lot of the great Christian mystics in Europe later on. And so there is a rich, long history and tradition of Western mysticism, very similar to the yoga tradition. And really the first so-called Christian mystic text, although of course Christ would not have used that terminology, nor Thomas, nor his disciples, but it is Christian mysticism, the Gospel of Thomas. It's like a Christian Upanishad, basically. It's like the Yoga Sutras of Christ, the Gospel of Thomas. And again, it is his original teachings, his original sayings. I'm sure there were changes made. You can even see a few very slight changes from the original Greek that we find from 130 AD to the Coptic, which came a couple hundred years later. There were some slight changes made, but not much, actually, surprisingly few. And so the scribes who copied these texts and translated these texts did their best, I think, to keep them pure. It's possible that the Gospel of Thomas was written in Aramaic originally, Jesus' language. We don't know. And then later translated to Greek. We don't know. At any rate, these teachings are essentially yoga teachings, or Advaita Vedanta. They're esoteric, mystical teachings, enlightenment teachings, in other words. So Jesus was a master. He was an enlightened master, extremely enlightened. Extremely enlightened. Probably one of the most enlightened beings who ever lived. Okay? And the evidence of that is found in the teachings of the Gospel of Thomas, Jesus' original sayings and teachings. And so I'd like to read a few verses and give some brief commentaries over those verses. I'm reading from the Thomas O. Lambden translation. There are many translations of the Gospel of Thomas. I've read most of them, and I really like Thomas O. Lambden's translation, so that's the one that I typically use. I'll start with verse 6. His disciples questioned him and said to him, "Do you want us to fast? How shall we pray? Shall we give alms? What diet shall we observe?" Jesus said, "Do not tell lies, and do not do what you hate, for all things are plain in the sight of heaven. For nothing hidden will not become manifest, and nothing covered will remain without being uncovered." So, in the Gospel of Thomas, there's not a lot of ethics or religious laws or customs to be followed. And essentially, Jesus is telling them, don't tell lies, don't do what you hate, for all things are plain in the sight of heaven. In other words, be true to yourself, follow your heart, do what you believe is right, follow your conscience. You already know what's right and what's wrong. Follow that. For nothing will be hidden, or for nothing hidden will not become manifest, and nothing covered will remain without being uncovered. This is an enlightenment teaching. My guru taught us often, Roy Eugene Davis, taught us that enlightenment is not an attainment, it is an unveiling or an uncovering. And I write about this in my own book, The Sacred Science of Yoga and the Five Koshas, which is available in paperback and Kindle on Amazon. It's sold about 10,000 copies now in a dozen or so countries. And I discuss this in that book, that essentially we have coverings called koshas in the yoga tradition. And these coverings or sheaths are said to cover our Atman or soul. Of course, the soul is immaterial, it's pure consciousness without any form, so you cannot cover it, but this is a way of understanding this concept or cosmology. And so essentially, we have these 5 sheaths or koshas or coverings that cover our soul, and they are the Annamaya kosha, or the physical body, the Pranamaya kosha, or the energetic or astral body or layer, the Manomaya kosha, which is the manas, or the mind, the mental layer, mental covering, the Vijnanamaya kosha, which is basically our intellect and ego also, and the Anandamaya kosha, which is a layer of spiritual bliss, spiritual ecstasy. And then we have the Atman, which is pure, unbounded, infinite, loving consciousness that is our true essence at the core of our being. And so Jesus here is essentially giving a teaching about the enlightenment process, and that it is in fact an uncovering, an unveiling of what we already are. So there really is no attainment. You cannot become more spiritual. In other words, no matter what you do, no matter how much you meditate, no matter how pure your diet is, no matter how many workshops you attend, how many books you read, you just can't become more spiritual. You already are that. At the core of your being, you are pure, unbounded, unlimited, infinite consciousness. You are a divine being. You are that. That fact will never change, regardless of anything you do. You cannot corrupt your soul. Your soul has no karma. Okay? The other layers of your being can accumulate karma, but your soul is forever pure. This is another difference between Jesus' actual teachings and the later corruptions of Paul and others regarding the sort of salvation theology, salvationist theology, or the sort of mainstream Christian theology developed by Paul, sort of charlatan cult leader, a very manipulative figure, who essentially created his own form of Christianity, not based upon Jesus' actual teachings. Paul, by the way, never knew Jesus. and he became a self-proclaimed apostle of Jesus, even though he had not known him or met him. And so this is an interesting contrast between what Jesus actually taught and then the later corruptions and this sort of co-opted form of Christianity that came to dominate Christianity, unfortunately. And so Paul, taught that we needed to be saved and that we were essentially terrible, wretched sinners. And of course, the Old Testament also teaches us this based upon Eve having eaten the apple from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and the Garden of Eden being tempted by the serpent. That created original sin, and so we are all tainted. The soul is tainted, and we require saving or salvation. In mystical traditions, all of them, we learn, in all Enlightenment traditions, we learn that the soul is pure, taintless. It's already pure and divine, and that it requires no salvation. All that is needed is the unveiling of our innate essence and our true highest nature as pure, loving, tranquil consciousness. So we already are that. It only needs to be uncovered or unveiled. So it is not an attainment, in other words. No matter how much we do, we cannot become more spiritual. We already are spirit at our core. It's simply that we have become identified with the superficial vibrations occurring on the superficial layers of our being. And so we become identified with these coverings or sheaths or koshas. And this creates illusion, maya. And we live in a sort of sleep state, on autopilot, sleepwalking through life, not knowing what we actually are, living in a matrix, an illusion, a grand illusion, believing that we are something that we are not. And so we are not these impermanent, changeable layers that cover the Atman. We are the Atman at the end of the day. That is what we are. So Jesus knew that. That's what he taught. And he always taught that the kingdom was within us. And it's not a future destination. And that the kingdom is in us and all around us. It's always with us. You are that, in other words. It's simply an uncovering, an unveiling of our true nature. In verse 8, and he said, "The man is like a wise fisherman who cast his net into the sea and drew it up from the sea full of small fish. Among them the wise fisherman found a fine large fish. He threw all the small fish back into the sea and chose the large fish without difficulty. Whoever has ears to hear, let him hear." And the teaching in this verse is about discernment, in Sanskrit, viveka, right? And so this is a teaching about discernment, learning how to discern the finite from the infinite. This is the path of jnana yoga, the yoga of discernment. And we must use our powers of viveka, or discernment, to discern what we are. Eventually, with practice, with enough experience, meditating superconsciously, one develops their discernment and cultivates their discernment. And in large part, this is a physiological process. And when we meditate daily, we drastically improve the power and function of the frontal lobes of the brain. And we know that the frontal lobes are responsible for concentration and discernment, along with self-control, will, power, and creativity. And so the more we meditate, the more we develop all of these really wonderful qualities. As yogis, we want to develop these qualities of concentration, will, self-control, discernment, creativity. And so the more you meditate, the more you develop these qualities. It's a physiological process. Long-term meditators, for example, tend to have much larger frontal lobes than non-meditators. And so I can certainly attest to this from my own personal experience, having meditated regularly now for about 15 years or so. Before I started a daily meditation practice, I thought I had a lot of discernment. As it would turn out, I was quite mistaken, and had to learn the hard way that, in fact, I was not very discerning. And now I'm far more discerning. I'm certainly not perfect, but now when I read something, for example, I immediately can detect what is false and what is true and what I'm reading. Also, when I watch the news, I know typically if someone's lying or misleading the public. Likewise, in my personal relationships and my personal conversations, interactions with folks, I tend to know people's intentions, motivations, whether or not they're telling the truth. And all of that has come about as I've opened my third eye, the Ajna Chakra, but also from these physiological changes that have occurred in my brain through the process of neuroplasticity. And I've increased the power and function of my frontal lobes, and I have far more discernment. And the most important type of discernment is being able to discern what we are. In other words, separating the wheat from the chaff, right? The finite from the infinite. Knowing what we are really versus this temporary, changeable body, mind, emotions, ego, personality, the false self, in other words. And so much of the spiritual path is the cultivation and development of discernment, of viveka, and learning how to discern what we are as infinite, permanent, divine beings, rather than these small, limited hominids that the scientific materialism of our day tries to convince us that we are. And so this is the process of discernment, and this is the teaching in verse 8. He also says, whoever has ears to hear, let him hear. Again, discernment. And he also talks about having the eyes to see and all of that. Having the ears to hear and the eyes to see. This means that we need to develop our intuition and our powers of discriminative intelligence or discernment so that we can hear the truth, we can see the truth, we can see through all of the bullshit. And this is especially true nowadays with so much propaganda being forced upon us in the news media, social media. There's so many lies to sift through these days, and discernment is becoming more and more important so that we can see the truth, we can hear the truth, we know the truth, and we don't fall for the propaganda. We don't fall for the lies being fed to us by these giant multinational corporations and governments and so on. So it's really important to develop the frontal lobes of the brain and to develop our powers of intuition and discernment so that we have the ears to hear, we have the eyes to see. Okay? I'll read verse 13, Jesus said to his disciples, "Compare me to someone and tell me whom I am like." Simon Peter said to him, "You are like a righteous angel." Matthew said to him, "You are like a wise philosopher." Thomas said to him, "Master, my mouth is wholly incapable of saying whom you are like." Jesus said, "I am not your master. Because you have drunk, you have become intoxicated from the bubbling spring which I have measured out." And he took him and withdrew and told him 3 things. When Thomas returned to his companions, they asked him, "What did Jesus say to you?" Thomas said to them, "If I tell you one of the things which he told me, you will pick up stones and throw them at me. A fire will come out of the stones and burn you up." Wow, it's pretty intense, huh? It's very interesting here that Jesus says, "I'm not your master." I'm not your master. He was, of course, their master and their teacher and their guru. But Jesus was so enlightened that he understood that it was simply a role that he was playing. And that God is the real master. The soul is the real master. This divine intelligence that is guiding our spiritual path and spiritual evolution is the real master, is the real guru. The so-called internal guru. And even in my own tradition, Yogananda said often that I am not the guru. God is the guru. I am simply his representative. And this is true. Ultimately, this is true. So Jesus says, "I am not your master because you have drunk. You have become intoxicated from the bubbling spring which I have measured out." In other words, you're awake. He was speaking directly to Thomas, who I believe was his most enlightened disciple, his so-called spiritual twin. Thomas got it. In other words, he understood. He understood the higher esoteric mystical teachings of Jesus. He got it. Yeah? And so he says, "I'm not your master because you have drunk, you have become intoxicated from the bubbling spring which I have measured out." In other words, you too are a master, Thomas. You've become a master in your own right because you learned from me and because you have absorbed my Shaktipat and you have received the transmission of Shaktipat that I've given you. That's what he's talking about here. You have become intoxicated from the bubbling spring, which I've measured out. He's been intoxicated with this spiritual ecstasy via the transmission of enlightened energy, which we call in the yoga tradition Shaktipat. Shaktipat is very real. Many of Mr. Davis's disciples, myself included, received his Shaktipat transmission regularly. So I can attest that this is 100% real, not just in my tradition, of course. Many yoga traditions speak of the importance of the Shaktipat transmission from guru to disciple. So once we have received the Shaktipat, once we have been baptized by the Holy Spirit, once we have been initiated into the sacred mysteries, we're ready to receive that innate interior divine intelligence. And the teachings of this innate divine wisdom and intelligence that guides our spiritual evolution. And then we become masters in our own right. So then Jesus went on to give Thomas some more secret teachings. And he only gave these very high teachings to a few worthy disciples. And so Thomas says, "Look, guys, I can't share these things with you. You won't get it. It's too much for you. You're not there yet. You're not ready. You won't get it. So I'm not going to even waste my time." And further evidence that Thomas got it. He was intellectually and spiritually capable of receiving the highest teachings that Jesus had to offer him. And so here today we've talked about Shaktipat transmission from guru to disciple. We've discussed the coverings that cover up our soul and the fact that the enlightenment process is an unveiling and uncovering of our true nature, of our divine nature, the soul, in other words. We've discussed the importance of discernment on the spiritual path. All of these are enlightenment teachings. All enlightenment traditions teach these concepts. All of them. And so Jesus had this in common with every other enlightenment tradition that has ever existed. And so we know Jesus was an enlightened master, and he was transmitting his enlightened consciousness to his disciples. And so we should, as Westerners, embrace this form of mysticism that we find in the original teachings of Jesus. The original Christianity was very similar to Buddhism or yoga or Advaita Vedanta. There's not a whole lot of difference. And this rich Western mysticism should be embraced by us as Western yogis. I understand the tendency to reject all things Judeo-Christian. Of course, many terrible things have been carried out in the name of Christ, in the name of Christianity and Judaism and this tradition. I completely understand, and I empathize greatly with people who feel that way, because I was like that for many years until I read the Gospel of Thomas in around 2009, 2010, something like that, when I was in my late 20s. And I really resonated with it, and it had a profound impact on me and how I viewed Christianity going forward. The scholarship now is so good. Again, I highly recommend to read The Ancient Gospels by Helmut Koester. A brilliant scholar, brilliant academic. The scholarship now is so good. See, even 50 years ago, we just didn't have this scholarship. Well, gosh, the Gospel of Thomas was only discovered in 1945, I believe. But the scholarship has improved drastically, dramatically. And we know so much more about the Q source now, for example. We know so much more about the corruption of the canonical Gospels and all of the changes that were made and alterations and everything. We know so much more. We have so much more scholarship about the Essenes now, and these groups of ascetic monks, basically yogis that were living around Galilee, that John the Baptist and Jesus were originally a part of. Perhaps they left that group and did their own thing later. But they come out of that context, and we know so much about the Essenes now. We know so much about the Gospel of Thomas now that we didn't know even 10 years ago. And so the scholarship is so good now that we can look back. We can return to our Christian roots if we so choose, as I have done. Of course, I'm a yogi and I teach Kriya Yoga, and I'm an ordained, authorized teacher in this lineage, and fully embrace my role within that tradition and everything. But I've also returned to my Christian roots now that I know what Christianity is and was originally. And there's nothing wrong with that. Especially if you are a vegetarian who practices meditation, practices contemplation, lives a good, wholesome lifestyle. Well, you can really resonate with the original Christianity and with the Essenes and all of this. There's not a whole lot of difference between original Christianity, coming out of that Essene tradition, and what Jesus actually taught in the Gospel of Thomas, and the yoga tradition. There's not a whole lot of difference. And so I encourage Westerners to really do their research and investigate the Gospel of Thomas and other early texts. There are other interesting texts that we can look at. And I'll probably do some future podcasts on some of the other so-called apocryphal texts and Gnostic texts and all of that. And the Syriac texts and things like that. Thank you so much for listening. And please share this podcast with others, subscribe, follow. Many blessings. Namaste.